For centuries, whispers of hidden wisdom have echoed through ancient texts, secret societies, and sacred symbols. A wisdom said to transcend religion, empire, and even time itself. In the early 20th century, a young man with no formal education and no credentials somehow uncovered it. His name was Manley Palmer Hall, and what he discovered connects forgotten rituals, lost civilizations, occult orders, and the very architecture of the human mind. Whether you believe that the world is shaped by hidden hands or guided by higher truths, what Hall uncovered forces us to reconsider both. Hall's work asks a question that we can't ignore. What if the secrets of the past were never lost, only hidden in plain sight? Manley P. Hall didn't set out to become a spiritual teacher, but from early life something called to him through books, symbols, and dreams, and from that moment on he lived as if he were following a thread, one woven through centuries, pulling him towards something vast, ancient, and unfinished. Over the next 6 decades, Hall would unlock ancient teachings. He would decode secret traditions and leave behind a body of work that continues to challenge conventional history. This series will take you through the spiritual codes embedded in mythology, sacred initiation rites, and teachings that may have been sequestered or intentionally suppressed. But in the end, his death raised as many questions as his life. Manuscripts disappeared, his inner circle changed, and whispers still remain of betrayal, suppression, and truths some believe were too dangerous to be shared. Today, nearly a century later, the ideas he explored are echoing through modern science, psychology, architecture, and even artificial intelligence. Could the symbols he decoded still be shaping the world we live in today? Born in 1901 in Peterborough, Ontario, Manley Palmer Hall was a quiet, observant child, neither academically or religiously inclined, but all the while of a curious nature. Abandoned at an early age, he was sent to live with his grandmother in the United States. Raised primarily in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Hall grew up in a religious and intellectual atmosphere, which fueled his curiosity and love for books. Manley P. Hall was technically not orphaned in the legal sense, but his early life was marked by a profound lack of parental presence and emotional stability. This neglect is something that I think really shaped his path as a seeker. His father abandoned the family shortly after he was born, and his mother, Louise Palmer Hall, was actually a Rosicrucian and a chiropractor, but she was often absent and eventually left Manley in the care of his maternal grandmother so that she could travel the world for work and spiritual studies. When his mother abandoned him, Manley was just 6 years old. His grandmother, Florence Palmer, raised him with quiet devotion until her own death roughly a decade later. Florence was a woman of quiet faith, a Rosicrucian and theosophist who was deeply interested in esoteric subjects. She fostered an atmosphere of moral seriousness and reverence for books. Though not wealthy, their small home in Sioux Falls was rich with scripture, encyclopedias, and quiet evenings of reading. She introduced Manley to mysticism, metaphysics, and ancient wisdom traditions from a very young age. It was there that Manley's inner world began to take shape, an intellectual and spiritual foundation where questions of God and the soul and destiny first took their root. This foundation would later blossom into a lifelong quest for hidden wisdom. After moving to South Pasadena, California, Florence supported Manley's early education and gave him access to libraries and lectures that shaped his worldview. She was very encouraging, but not dogmatic. She allowed Manley to explore many systems of thought freely. Hall later said that his grandmother's influence gave him his philosophical foundation. While he had no formal higher education, the eclectic and intensive intellectual atmosphere she fostered became the equivalent of a spiritual and philosophical apprenticeship. But by Hall's 17th birthday, his grandmother's health was failing and she soon left this world. Manley was only a teenager, but he was left truly alone, not orphaned by war or disaster, but by the slow, silent unraveling of intimate connection. Because Manley was said to have always been a quiet child, and I think the combination of his mother and father abandoning him, plus his grandmother's death, probably was devastating, and this must have been a very lonely and difficult time for him. And I think it's probably safe to say that he found solace in books. He soon found himself in Los Angeles, a city of contradictions. Los Angeles was wild in the 1910s. It was part mystic haven, part showbiz circus, but I think for Hall it was more sacred ground, because he began haunting esoteric bookstores and sitting in theosophy lectures and absorbing occult journals like a sponge. Hall's early education in Los Angeles was fueled in large part by his regular visits to occult and metaphysical bookstores, particularly around the Bunker Hill and downtown LA area, which at the time had a surprising number of spiritualist hubs. In the back rooms of metaphysical libraries, something stirred. And it wasn't just knowledge or learning. To Hall, it was more akin to remembrance. Hall found himself drawn to philosophies that traced their roots to Atlantis, to Egypt, and to the ancient East. Hermeticism spoke of a cosmos mirrored in man, where thought and spirit could shape reality. Neoplatonism revealed the soul's descent into matter and its return through beauty, virtue, and contemplation. Rosicrucianism offered secret rites of purification and awakening. And Freemasonry, to him, was a living ritual, a symbolic map of the initiate's inner construction. To Hall, these were not just belief systems, they were maps for the soul. At just 19 years old, Hall gave his first public lecture on reincarnation, and it happened unexpectedly at the Church of the People, which was a liberal metaphysical congregation in Los Angeles, which was known for its open-door policy to speakers on things like spirituality, theosophy, and the occult. The scheduled speaker for that day just didn't show up for some reason, and another audience member who was impressed by Manley P. Hall urged him to step in. He chose the topic of reincarnation as it was his recent fascination. He spoke without notes, yet with clarity and calm authority. Hall lived modestly in boarding houses and rented rooms, often surrounded by other seekers, artists, and wanderers of the new spiritual movement. He took on odd jobs, clerical work, assistant roles in bookshops, and even helped a spiritualist healer. But it was his lectures that would soon sustain him. Word spread, and audiences grew. He seemed to speak not from books, but from a memory buried in the bones of the earth. And before long, quiet patrons began to appear. They helped support his mission, allowing him to devote himself completely to his path. At 25, Hall published The Secret Teachings of All Ages, a 750-page illuminated tome that became a kind of spiritual Rosetta Stone, a key to the hidden language of the world's mysteries. The book was considered by some to be a ritual object, 7 years in the making, encyclopedic, mythic, and profoundly symbolic, Some of the passages in Secret Teachings were nothing short of revolutionary for the time. Hall wrote of Atlantis as a symbol of both past grandeur and future warning, long before it was a Hollywood trope. He decoded Egyptian initiation rituals as psychological journeys of death and rebirth. He suggested that behind mythologies like those of Dionysus and Osiris were hidden blueprints for spiritual transformation. These weren't just metaphors and myths for Hall. For him, they were instructions, encoded teachings that could literally awaken a dormant soul. The book was funded by silent donors, people who saw Hall as something more than a gifted speaker. Chief among them was Carolyn Lloyd, a wealthy widow from Los Angeles who believed in Hall's mission so deeply that she may have mortgaged her own home to bring it to life. Some speculate that other benefactors included high-ranking Freemasons, Theosophists, or members of a hidden esoteric society who recognized in Hall a living bridge to the ancient mysteries. Their names were never recorded, their identities never revealed. To some, this would raise questions. Why would secret societies, so often accused of hoarding knowledge, fund a project like this? But Hall's relationship to these traditions was not one of loyalty. He sought not to protect their mysteries, to be complicit in the secrecy, but to make them known, to liberate wisdom, not conceal it. Now, this is where some viewers may grow uneasy, and I completely get it. We've got Freemasonic symbols, we have rituals, secrecy, but I think what you need to understand is that for Hall, he wasn't trying to recruit anybody into anything. He was simply translating. He believed the power of the mystery schools could not be hoarded by the elite, but rather they belonged to the sincere. He never claimed to be a spiritual master or a guru. He simply said, "I am a student of the ancient wisdom, and I invite you to study with me." Producing the secret teachings of all ages was a monumental feat. Hall traveled the world. He worked with translators, historians, and artists to bring the vision to life, sourcing ancient texts in Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Sanskrit. He cross-referenced rare manuscripts from forgotten corners of the world and spent years compiling, verifying, and refining. The book explores subjects that even today are difficult to summarize: the Kabbalah, Pythagorean mathematics, alchemical emblems, Islamic mysticism, Neoplatonic cosmology, and initiatory rites from the Eleusinian mysteries. One chapter maps the geometry of the human soul. Another decodes tarot as a symbolic history of consciousness. To study them, Hall believed, was to remember what had been hidden, not by accident, but by design. And in a time when these topics were kept behind lodge doors or buried in obscure academic journals, Hall laid them bare for anyone with the will to seek. And this wasn't some new age feel-good philosophy. These were the philosophical bones of civilizations, the inner blueprints passed down through symbols and veils, offering only transformation, not affirmation. Among the teachings Hall explored was the Masonic legend of Hiram Abiff, which is central to the rituals of Freemasonry. According to the story, Hiram was the master builder of Solomon's temple, and because of this status, he was entrusted with a sacred secret known only to a few. This secret is known as the Master's Word. What exactly the word was, no one really knows, but the legend suggests that it was the literal name of God. According to this legend, the Master's Word symbolized secret, profound knowledge given to the three Grand Masters overseeing the temple's construction. It's said that he received the word from King Solomon himself, and he is entrusted with safeguarding this sacred word until the temple's completion. So, Hiram knows the Master's Word, the name of God. And he's doing his thing. He's building the great Temple of Solomon when one day he's approached by 3 of the other workers. The 3 men surround Hiram and they demand that he give them the master's word. If he refuses, they'll kill him. Well, as the story goes, Hiram chose death over revealing the sacred knowledge. The 3 men killed him and they buried him in a shallow grave, and with him, the true word was lost forever. But Hall believed that this wasn't literal history. It was more initiation. Hiram represents the human soul, struck down by ignorance, fear, and materialism, the 3 men. Buried in matter, a shallow grave, and there it waits to be raised. And the master's word? Hall wrote that it wasn't a utterance, a password, or a phrase. It was more a vibration, a realization. The true name of God not as a syllable, but as a state of consciousness. To lose the word was to forget our divine origin. To recover it was to reawaken, to emerge from our shallow grave of the 3rd dimension and reunite our consciousness with the infinite. Hall spoke often of an invisible order, a fraternity of souls who incarnate and appear throughout history to uplift humanity. He named it the Order of the Quest. He never said he belonged to it, but many who studied him and people who have studied his work believed that he could have been one of them, one of these living initiates, a kind of philosopher messenger incarnated to remind the world of its forgotten purpose. Hall warned of a coming time when the mind would be so overwhelmed by trivialities that it would lose its capacity for reflection. He wrote of the dangers of a society obsessed with spectacle. He warned that the mind, left unguarded, would be ruled not by tyrants, but by distraction. In one lecture he wrote, "When man becomes so involved in outer things that he loses his inner quietude, he has made a mistake that may cost him dearly." He cautioned that the world's noise would eventually drown out the voice of the soul. The real danger, he said, is not that man will destroy the world, but that he will destroy himself by forgetting who he is. Long before Hall, another figure brought light to a darkened world, and paid dearly for it. In Greek mythology, Prometheus defied the gods by stealing fire and giving it to humanity. For this, he's punished, chained to a rock and condemned to suffer. But fire in this tale is not destruction. It was knowledge, illumination, a gift meant to awaken. In classical antiquity, Prometheus was seen as a tragic hero, an archetype of rebellion, intellect, and human progress. The Romantic poets reframed Prometheus as a symbol of noble defiance against tyranny. Manley P. Hall didn't revolutionize the general opinion of the Prometheus myth in mainstream culture, but he did reframe it in a uniquely spiritual and initiatory way for Western esoteric students, many of whom had never considered it as more than a cautionary tale. Hall believed that Prometheus was more than just a myth. He was the archetype of the spiritual rebel, a bearer of the flame of higher consciousness, the initiate who brings light to those still trapped in shadow and is gravely punished for it by the gods. Hall saw this not as a story of punishment, but rather of purpose. To him, fire was the symbol of inner illumination, and as Hall's own teaching spread, he saw this pattern repeated in his own story. He warned that bringing truth to a sleeping world always comes at a price, that those who carry light often walk alone, but he also believed that hidden within the pain of Prometheus was the promise of the soul's regeneration. Those who know the story will of course be asking, well, what about Hercules? And yes, there is a happy ending to the story where the hero, Hercules, kills the eagle and breaks the chains binding Prometheus. Hercules, in this context, according to Hall, represents the higher self or the awakened will, the force that cuts through suffering and frees the soul from its karmic bondage. In our own time, others have dared to bring fire. The person who defies the mainstream narrative speaks of new truths and challenges the status quo. They commonly aren't met with debate, but exile and ruin. This is the Promethean path, a path that Hall walked quietly and others continue to walk, carrying the fire of enlightenment and bearing the weight that comes with it. Hall's search for truth didn't unfold in complete isolation, and though it seemed that he was sort of married to his work, he did for a time share his life with someone else, and her name was Faye. Faye Hall, intelligent, elegant, and deeply spiritual in her own right. They married in their 20s, and for a time it seemed she might walk the path with him. But the burden of being a spiritual messenger is often heavy, and though little is written about their parting, those close to Hall suggest that the weight of his mission left little room for anything else. Hall was not a cold person, but he was very consumed by his work, and in 1941, Faye unfortunately took her own life. Some say her passing haunted him for the rest of his life. Others believe he simply folded the pain into silence, retreating further into his work. What is clear is that Hall, from that point forward, became more guarded, less inclined to share the man behind the message. Hall once said, "The true philosopher must live alone, not because the world has rejected him, but because the fire he carries is too consuming to hold with another." Now, whether he said that from a place of wisdom or grief, we may never know, but perhaps it explains the solitary nature of his life. Hall eventually found love again, but what followed wasn't a peaceful end to a remarkable life. His death was marked by chaos, missing manuscripts, a body discovered under suspicious circumstances, and to this day, those closest to him offer conflicting accounts. Some even going as far as to suggest that Hall knew his end was near. Some say it was natural, others whisper of betrayal. But whatever the truth, something went terribly wrong. A man who spent his life warning of ulterior motives, could he have missed the traitor in his own home? For all his writing on mystery schools, Hall never called himself an initiate or a master. He made no demands for loyalty, no claims of divinity. Instead, he offered his life, quietly, obsessively, to the preservation of ancient wisdom. And in the end, that's what makes Hall so compelling. Not just what he taught, but how he lived. A man who gave everything to a truth he could never fully explain. A seeker who, in lighting the way for others, may have dimmed the warmth of his own life. He didn't ask for followers, only seekers. And what he left behind is not a legacy of belief, but an invitation to remember, to question, to burn just brightly enough to find your own way through the dark. Could Hall's life be more than a coincidence? Could it be a spiritual assignment given to him by the gods? For all the pages he wrote and lectures he gave, Hall left behind no dogma, only doorways. And in every symbol and every myth, he left the same invitation for us to seek. Not to follow blindly, not to believe without question, but to look again, to listen deeper, to remember something that your soul might already know. You don't have to believe everything that Hall believed, but you might ask, why did he dedicate his entire life to this? What was he trying to preserve or protect? Somewhere, even now, someone may be following the same thread Hall once followed. through forgotten books, and through inner questions. In this first chapter, we met a young seeker, shaped more by isolation than instruction. We followed his journey through loss, libraries, and long-forgotten symbols, towards a body of wisdom most never even knew existed. Hall didn't ask for us to follow him. He asked us to think, to wonder, to remember. And as the mysteries unfold, so does the deeper question: what if the ancient knowledge he discovered was meant for this moment in time? In our next episode, we follow the thread across time to an emerging nation guided by ideals that seem noble, but whose origins may be older and stranger than we've been told. Was America born from freedom or from a forgotten blueprint? Because some secrets didn't stay buried in temples or tombs, they were carried across oceans, etched into architecture, and encrypted into the founding documents of a new empire. The founding fathers spoke of liberty, but some whispered of destiny, and Hall saw a difference between what was preached and what's been practiced. Next time on Hall of Mysteries, America's Secret Destiny. This isn't just the story of an occultist or a philosopher. It's a journey through the mysteries themselves. In this series, we won't just examine Manley P. Hall, we'll follow him through ancient symbols and secret orders, betrayals, and the spiritual truths that still live in silence. And from here, the deeper journey begins. This is Hall of Mysteries, and the door has only just opened.